The phone rang 3 times before Dario Moretti answered it, and by the third ring, every man in the room had gone quiet. Nobody spoke while Dario was on a call. Nobody breathed too loudly either. He listened for 11 seconds, said only one word, and set the phone down on the marble table like it was made of glass. "It's done," he said. The room let out a breath it had been holding for 6 months. Marco Bellini, the only man Dario trusted with everything, poured 2 glasses of dark red wine and slid one across the table. Across the city, a man named Victor Callahan, who had spent half a year trying to take territory that belonged to Dario, had just been convinced, permanently and completely, to give up the fight. Nobody in the room asked for details. Details were never shared. Results were. Dario Moretti was 44 years old, and for 20 of those years, he had been the kind of man other men feared, without needing to be told why. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply made decisions, and those decisions became reality, because everyone around him understood that arguing with Dario Moretti was a mistake made only once. His penthouse sat on the top floor of a glass tower overlooking the harbor, and from where he stood, the whole city looked like something he owned, even the parts he didn't. Guards were posted at every entrance. Cameras covered every hallway. 3 men checked every visitor twice before they were allowed anywhere near him. In 20 years, nobody had ever gotten close to Dario Moretti without his permission. That was the thing about control. Once you had enough of it, you stopped noticing it, the same way a person stops noticing the sound of their own heartbeat. Dario had built a life so tightly sealed that surprises simply did not happen to him anymore. He liked it that way. He had earned it that way. Marco raised his glass. "To Callahan," he said, "and to every fool who thinks he can take what's yours." Dario didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened, just slightly, the closest thing to satisfaction the man allowed himself in public. He drank. The wine was good. The night was quiet. 6 months of pressure had finally broken, and for the first time since the trouble started, Dario Moretti let his shoulders drop half an inch. Around him, the room began to relax the way rooms do when the person in charge finally does. Someone put music on, low enough to talk over. Charlotte Vance, who handled Dario's finances and knew more about his money than he did, laughed at something one of the younger men said. Nathaniel Gray, the head of Dario's security, stood near the window with his arms crossed, still watching the door out of habit, even though the celebration meant the danger, for tonight at least, had passed. Dario watched all of it from his chair like a king surveying a kingdom that had just gotten a little bit bigger. He thought about Callahan, about the 6 months of careful moves it had taken to end that particular war without a single mistake. He thought about the empire he had built from nothing, brick by brick, deal by deal, and how close it had come to real trouble this time. And now it was over. Now there was nothing standing between him and the next 20 years of doing exactly what he wanted. He had no way of knowing that his life, the one he had built so carefully, was about to change forever in the next few minutes. In the one room in his home where he had never once expected to find anything but silence. "I'm stepping out," Dario said, rising from his chair. Nobody questioned him. Nobody ever did. He walked down the long hallway that led away from the main room, past the framed art he had bought because it was expensive rather than because he liked it, past the security panel that blinked green because everything, tonight, was exactly as it should be. At the end of the hallway was a single door, unmarked, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know better. It led to the one bathroom in the penthouse that Dario considered entirely his own, a room even his most trusted men were not permitted to enter. The lock on that door was not decorative. It was a serious mechanism, installed by a man Dario paid well precisely because he never asked questions. The door locked automatically from the inside, and it could only be opened again by a code that existed in exactly one place, Dario's memory. Not even Marco knew it. Not even Nathaniel, who had once joked that he probably knew more about Dario's life than Dario did. In 20 years, that door had never once opened without Dario's hand on it. He reached it now, tired in the pleasant way a man is tired after solving a problem that had kept him up at night for half a year. He reached for the handle without thinking. The same motion he had made 1,000 times before, an action so automatic it barely registered as a decision at all. The handle turned. For half a second, Dario didn't understand what that meant. His hand had simply done what it always did, and the door had simply done what it was supposed to do. except it wasn't supposed to do that. Not without the code, not without his hand entering 4 numbers into a panel that had not made a sound. He looked down. The panel's light was green, unlocked. It had been unlocked before he ever touched it. Something cold moved through Dario's chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it as fear. In 20 years of building the kind of life where nothing was allowed to surprise him, he had forgotten what it felt like when something did. He should have called for Nathaniel. Every instinct he had built over 2 decades told him to step back, to raise his voice, to bring 3 armed men to this door before he opened it another inch. That was the smart thing. That was the safe thing. That was the thing the version of Dario Moretti from 10 years ago would have done without hesitation. Instead, he pushed the door open himself. The bathroom was lit the way he always kept it, soft and low, meant for quiet moments rather than bright ones. And standing at the sink, with her back nearly to him but her eyes already lifted to meet his in the mirror, was a woman he had never seen before in his life. She did not gasp. She did not reach for a weapon or bolt for a window that did not exist in that small, sealed room. She simply looked at him, calm as still water, as though she had been standing there for an hour, waiting for exactly this moment to arrive, as though the door opening was not an accident at all, but an appointment she had kept. Dario Moretti had faced down men twice his size without blinking. He had sat across tables from people who wanted him gone, and never once let his hand shake. But standing in the doorway of the one room in his life that had never held a single surprise, looking at a stranger who should not have been able to get within 100 feet of him, let alone inside a locked room with no other way in or out, he found that his body would not move. He did not reach for anything. He did not shout for his men down the hall. Some part of him, the part that had survived 20 years in a business where every mistake could be the last one he ever made, understood immediately that this was not an ordinary threat. An ordinary threat would have already made a move. An ordinary threat would not be standing so still, watching him with an expression that looked less like fear and more like patience. The woman was perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back simply, dressed in clothes that gave away nothing about who she was or how she had gotten there. Her hands were empty and visible, resting on the edge of the sink. Her eyes never left his. Seconds passed. They felt much longer. Down the hallway, laughter drifted faintly from the celebration still going on, unaware that the most important conversation of the night, perhaps of Dario's entire life, was about to happen in complete silence, 20 feet away from all of them. Dario finally found his voice, though it came out lower and less certain than he was used to hearing from himself. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer right away. She studied him for a long moment, the way a person studies something they've thought about for years, and are only now seeing in person for the first time. Then, slowly, she reached up and turned off the tap she had apparently been standing beside, and the small sound of dripping water stopped, leaving only silence between them. "You don't remember me," she said finally, and it wasn't a question. "I didn't think you would. You wouldn't have any reason to." Dario's mind raced through every face he had ever crossed paths with, every deal, every rival, every name that had ever mattered enough to remember. Nothing matched. He was certain, in the way he was certain of very little else in that moment, that he had never seen this woman before in his life. "That's not an answer," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She took a small step forward, not toward him, but simply shifting her weight, the movement of someone settling in, rather than someone preparing to run or to strike. Dario's hand twitched instinctively toward his side, an old habit, but he stopped himself. Something about her stillness told him that whatever was about to happen here would not be solved with force, and some quiet, older part of him, the part that had once been a much younger and much less certain man, wanted to know what she had come to say before he decided what to do about it. "You have 30 seconds, Dario said, "before I call the men standing 60 feet from this door." "You won't," the woman said, and there was no arrogance in the way she said it, only a strange and unsettling certainty. "Not yet. Not until you hear why I'm here." Dario said nothing, but he also didn't move toward the hallway, and in the silence that followed, standing frozen in the doorway of the one room in his life he had believed was completely, permanently safe, Dario Moretti understood that whatever this woman was about to tell him, it was going to change something. He could feel it already, the way a person feels the air shift before a storm arrives, long before the first drop of rain ever falls. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Talk," he said, "and it had better be worth the 30 seconds I already gave you." The woman looked at him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was quiet, steady, and completely without fear. "My name is Elena," she said, "and 20 years ago, you made a decision that ended my father's life. I didn't come here tonight to hurt you, Dario. I came here because there's something you need to know before this night is over, something that changes everything you think you understand about who gave that order, and why." Dario stood perfectly still, and for the first time in 20 years, the most powerful man in the city had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. Dario did not move. He did not speak. The name Elena meant nothing to him, but the words that followed it, "my father's life," sat in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples he could not yet see the shape of. "I don't know your father," he said finally, though even as he said it, doubt crept in behind the words. 20 years was a long time, 20 years and hundreds of decisions, some of them made in rooms much like this one, quiet conversations that ended lives without a single raised voice. "You wouldn't remember his name," Elena said. "You never met him. You never even knew what he looked like. That's the part that matters most, Dario. You destroyed a man's entire life, and you never once had to see his face while you did it." "I don't destroy lives based on rumors from strangers who break into locked rooms," Dario said, and his voice had found some of its old edge again, the tone that made grown men lower their eyes. "You have information you think means something to me. Fine. Give it to me plainly, or I open that door and let my men decide what happens to you." Elena's expression didn't change. If anything, something in her posture softened, as though his threat had confirmed something she already believed about him, rather than frightened her. 20 years ago, she said, there was a man named Vincent Whitfield. He ran a small shipping company out of the eastern docks. Nothing large, nothing that should have ever crossed paths with someone like you. He had a wife. He had a daughter who was 7 years old. He had no interest in the kind of business you were building. He wanted nothing more than to keep his company small enough that nobody important would ever notice it. Dario's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Something about the name, Whitfield, stirred faintly at the edge of his memory, distant and half-formed, like a word heard once in a language he no longer spoke fluently. "Somebody noticed him anyway," Elena continued. "Somebody decided that Vincent Whitfield's little shipping company sat on a route that mattered, and that a man who refused to sell his business to the right people was a problem worth solving. That somebody came to you, 20 years ago, when you were still climbing, still trying to prove that you belonged at the tables you were sitting at, and you were told that Vincent Whitfield needed to disappear from the picture completely, for the good of everyone involved." "You're telling me a story," Dario said, though the words came out quieter than he intended. "You have no proof that I had anything to do with any of this." "I have 20 years of proof," Elena said. "I have a childhood spent being moved from one safe house to another, because the people protecting me were afraid of exactly the kind of man you are. I have a mother who never spoke my father's name again after that year, because it hurt too much, and because she was terrified that saying it out loud might bring the same trouble back to our door. I have every night I spent as a little girl, asking why my father wasn't coming home, and getting told, over and over, that some men make decisions and other people simply have to live with the consequences." Her voice hadn't risen. That was, somehow, worse than if she had shouted. Dario had spent his career around people who screamed, who threatened, who tried to make themselves feel powerful in front of him because they were afraid. Elena's calm was something else entirely. It felt earned, the calm of someone who had already survived the worst version of this conversation 100 times inside her own head, long before she ever stood in front of him to have it in person. "Even if every word you've said is true," Dario said slowly, "you understand what kind of world I live in. Decisions get made. People who threaten a business get removed from the equation. That's not a confession, Elena. That's simply how things work, and it has worked that way since long before I was the one making the calls." "I know," Elena said, and something flickered across her face that Dario couldn't quite read, something closer to sadness than anger. "I've had 20 years to understand exactly how things work in your world. I stopped being angry about that a long time ago. I'm not here tonight because I want you to feel guilty about following the rules of the life you chose. Then why are you here? Dario asked. Because if it's not for revenge, and it's not for guilt, I'm having trouble understanding what a stranger risks getting inside a room like this one for. Elena was quiet for a moment, her eyes drifting briefly to the locked door behind him, and Dario noticed, for the first time, that she had been glancing at that door the entire conversation, as though she was as aware of the danger just outside it as he was. Because you didn't give that order, she said finally. The order to remove my father from his business, to make sure he never caused a problem again. It didn't come from you deciding my father was dangerous. You were told he was dangerous by someone you trusted completely. Someone who wanted my father's company gone for reasons that had nothing to do with you, or with any threat he actually posed. You were used, Dario. 20 years ago, someone close to you needed a problem solved, and instead of solving it themselves, they handed you a story, and you believed it, because you had no reason not to. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in around a conversation that had shifted from something Dario could dismiss to something he could not stop turning over in his mind. He thought of the men who had surrounded him 20 years ago, young and hungry the same as he had been, all of them climbing toward positions of power that most of them never reached. Some of those men were dead now. Some had simply vanished from his life, the way people did in this business, moving on to other cities, other lives, other names. And some of them were still standing in the room down the hallway right now, drinking his wine, laughing at jokes, having earned Dario's trust so completely over the decades that he had never once thought to question it. Who, Dario said, and his voice had dropped low, almost a whisper, told me that Vincent Whitfield needed to be removed. Elena held his gaze steadily, and for the first time since he had opened that door, Dario saw something shift behind her eyes, a flicker of hesitation, as though the next words cost her something significant to say out loud. I think you already suspect, she said quietly. I think some part of you has known for a long time that the story you were told 20 years ago never quite added up, and you buried that feeling because looking at it too closely would have meant questioning someone you needed to trust in order to survive in this life. Down the hallway, a burst of laughter rose above the music, and both of them went still, listening. Footsteps approached, unhurried, and paused somewhere near the hallway's midpoint. Dario recognized the rhythm of that walk immediately. Nathaniel Gray, doing what Nathaniel always did, checking every corner of the penthouse out of habit, even during a celebration meant to be free of worry. If he opens that door, Dario said quietly, you understand what happens to you. I understand, Elena said, and there was no fear in her voice, only a kind of resigned steadiness. I've understood that risk since before I decided to come here tonight. I decided it was worth it anyway, because you deserve to hear the truth from someone who actually knows it, instead of continuing to believe a story that was never really yours to carry. The footsteps outside paused directly in front of the door. Dario watched the handle, half expecting it to turn, his mind already working through the impossible task of explaining a locked room, a stranger, and a story that threatened to unravel 2 decades of loyalty he had built his entire life around. He glanced at Elena. She hadn't moved, hadn't reached for anything, hadn't so much as tensed the way a person does when they're preparing to run or fight. She simply watched the door with the same unsettling calm she had shown him from the very beginning. A long second passed. Then another. The footsteps moved on, continuing down the hallway toward the far end of the penthouse, and Dario let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You're very calm, he said, for someone who almost just got caught in a locked room with a man like me. I've spent my whole life being calm about things that terrify most people, Elena said. It's a skill you learn when you grow up constantly waiting for the past to catch up with you. I stopped being afraid of you a long time ago, Dario. What I've been afraid of, for years, is that I would never get the chance to say any of this to your face, that whoever set my father up would simply keep operating in the shadows for the rest of both our lives, using people like you as a weapon, without either of you ever fully understanding what was really happening. Dario studied her for a long moment, searching her face for the lie he was certain must be there somewhere. The angle, the trick, the reason a stranger would risk her life to deliver a story this complicated to a man who could end her existence with a single word to the people down the hall. He found nothing. Whatever Elena Whitfield was, She did not carry herself like someone spinning a story for personal gain. "Say his name," Dario said quietly. "The person you think set all of this in motion. Say it now, or this conversation is over." Elena's eyes held his, steady and unblinking, and when she finally spoke, the name that left her lips landed in the small, quiet bathroom like a stone dropped from a great height, cracking something in Dario Moretti that had stood unshaken for 20 years. The name, she said, belonged to a man standing less than 60 feet away from them at that very moment, laughing, drinking wine, celebrating a victory that Dario now understood might never have needed to happen at all, if the truth about his past had been different from the story he had always believed. Dario Moretti stood frozen in the doorway of his own bathroom, staring at a stranger who had just handed him a truth he had never asked for. And for the first time since he had built his empire from nothing, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. The name hung in the air between them, and Dario felt something cold settle into his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in so long he barely recognized it anymore. Doubt. Real, unshakable doubt, aimed not at a stranger or a rival, but at the one man he had trusted without question for over 20 years. "Marco," Dario said, the name tasting strange in his own mouth, like a word he had spoken 1,000 times before but never once truly examined. "You're telling me Marco Bellini is the reason your father is gone." "I'm telling you what I know," Elena said. "And I know it because I spent years finding people who were still alive to tell it to me. It took a long time, Dario. Most of the people who could have confirmed any of this were gone before I ever started looking. But I found one man, an old associate of your organization who left this life entirely, who remembered a conversation from 20 years ago. He remembered Marco Bellini asking around about a shipping route on the eastern docks, asking who controlled it, asking how to make the man who owned it disappear from the equation without drawing suspicion back to himself." Dario's mind, against his will, began pulling threads from a past he rarely allowed himself to revisit. 20 years ago, he had been 24 years old, ambitious and unproven, desperate to demonstrate to the people above him that he belonged among the serious players rather than the disposable ones. Marco had been the one who came to him with the information about Vincent Whitfield, the one who explained, calmly and convincingly, why the man's small shipping operation posed a threat to territory that mattered. Dario remembered trusting every word of it, because at 24, trusting Marco Bellini's judgment had felt like the safest decision available to him. "Why would Marco want a small shipping company gone?" Dario said slowly, thinking out loud more than actually asking Elena. "It makes no sense. Marco had no stake in that route back then. He wasn't even senior enough to care about Eastern dock traffic." "He wasn't senior yet," Elena said. "That's exactly the point. My father's shipping company controlled a route that, on its own, meant very little to anyone, but it happened to run directly alongside a second business, a smaller and much less legal operation, that Marco Bellini was quietly building for himself, something he never wanted connected to his name or to yours. My father noticed things happening along that route that didn't add up. He asked questions. He mentioned those questions to the wrong person at the wrong dinner, and within a month, Marco decided the safest path forward was making sure my father's questions stopped permanently." Dario said nothing. His mind raced backward through 2 decades of memory, searching for confirmation, for contradiction, for anything solid enough to hold on to. He remembered how quickly Marco had risen after that year, how effortlessly he had climbed from a minor associate to the second most powerful man in Dario's organization. He had always assumed that rise was earned through loyalty and skill. He had never once considered that it might have been built, at least in part, on the foundation of a lie told to a 24-year-old man who had no reason yet to question anyone. "You understand what you're asking me to believe," Dario said finally. "You're asking me to accept that the man standing 60 feet from this door, the man I trust more than anyone alive, orchestrated the removal of your father to protect a business he never told me about, and then let me believe, for 20 years, that the decision was mine, and mine alone." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Elena said. "I'm telling you what I found, because you deserve to know it, and because I could no longer live with the idea that the truth might die with me, before anyone who could actually do something about it ever heard it. What you choose to do with that truth is entirely yours to decide." Dario turned away from her for the first time since the conversation had begun, moving to lean against the edge of the sink, staring at his own reflection in the mirror, as though the man looking back at him might have an answer that Elena did not. He thought of every quiet moment over the past 20 years when Marco had been at his side, advising him, protecting him, seemingly devoted to nothing except Dario's success. He thought of the nights Marco had stayed awake with him, working through problems that threatened everything they had built together. He thought of the trust he had placed in that man, trust so complete that he had never once installed a lock or a camera anywhere Marco couldn't access, because the idea of needing protection from Marco Bellini had simply never crossed his mind. If this is true, Dario said quietly, more to himself than to Elena, then everything I built after that year, every decision I made, believing I understood exactly why I made it, was built on top of something I never actually chose for myself. That's the part I understood the most, when I finally learned all of this, Elena said, her voice softening slightly for the first time since she had begun speaking. You didn't choose to destroy my father's life, Dario. Not really. You were handed a story and asked to act on it, the same way soldiers are handed orders without always being told the full truth behind them. That doesn't erase what happened to my family, but it does mean the anger I spent years carrying toward you was never entirely fair, once I understood who was really responsible. Dario turned back to face her, studying her more closely now than he had at any point since the door had first opened. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at having delivered a blow that had visibly shaken him. If anything, she looked tired, the way a person looks after finally setting down a weight they have carried for far too long. Why come here tonight? Dario asked. Why not simply take what you know to someone who could use it against Marco directly, or against me, if that's truly what you wanted? Because I'm not interested in destroying either of you, Elena said. I spent years thinking that's exactly what I wanted, that finding the truth would mean finding a way to make someone pay for what happened to my family. But somewhere along the way, that stopped being the point. My father wasn't a violent man, Dario. He believed in fairness, in people eventually getting the chance to know the truth even when it was inconvenient or dangerous to share it. I decided a long time ago that if I ever found my way to you, I would give you that same chance, rather than becoming the kind of person who uses truth as a weapon instead of a gift. Something shifted in Dario's chest at those words, a discomfort he wasn't used to feeling, the sensation of being shown a kind of decency he had rarely encountered in the world he had spent his adult life navigating. He thought of the men who surrounded him daily, all of them motivated, in one way or another, by ambition, fear, or self-interest. He could not remember the last time someone had told him something that cost them nothing to keep hidden and everything to reveal. You still haven't told me how you got in here, Dario said. That door has one code. I've never shared it with anyone, not even Marco. Locks like that don't fail on their own. Elena hesitated, and for the first time, something like genuine uncertainty crossed her face. That's the part I haven't fully explained to you yet, she said. And it's the part that's going to matter most, once you understand it. Because the code to that door wasn't broken from the outside, Dario. Somebody who already knew it gave it to me. The words landed heavier than anything she had said before, and Dario felt the floor of his understanding shift beneath him once again. He had assumed, without ever fully articulating it to himself, that Elena had found some clever way around his security, some flaw in a system he had trusted completely. The idea that someone inside his own life, someone with access to information that existed nowhere except inside his own memory, had willingly handed that access to a stranger, was a different kind of danger entirely. Who? Dario said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very still, the tone of a man standing at the edge of something he was not certain he wanted to look down into. Before Elena could answer, a sharp knock landed on the door behind Dario. 3 quick raps followed by a familiar voice calling his name from the hallway. Close enough now that there was no more time left to decide anything carefully. It was Marco. Dario, the voice called, casual and warm, utterly unaware of what was unfolding on the other side of that door. You've been gone 20 minutes. Everyone's asking where the man of the hour disappeared to. Dario's eyes locked with Elena's, and in that single frozen second, both of them understood that whatever happened next would decide everything that followed, not just for the rest of that night, but for the rest of both their lives. Give me a minute, Marco, Dario called out, forcing his voice into a steadiness he did not feel. I'll be right there. There was a pause on the other side of the door, just long enough for Dario's heart to climb into his throat. Then Marco's voice came back, easy and unconcerned. Take your time. Nathaniel's already got everyone thinking you're just enjoying a quiet moment away from the noise. A short laugh followed, and then footsteps retreating back down the hallway, unhurried, unaware. Dario let out a breath he had been holding since the first knock, and when he turned back to Elena, something in his expression had changed. The shock of the last several minutes had begun settling into something harder, more focused, the look of a man who had spent 20 years learning how to make decisions under pressure, and was now applying that same discipline to the most personal crisis he had ever faced. Tell me who gave you that code, Dario said. Now, before I open this door and end this conversation permanently. Elena studied him for a moment, as though weighing, one last time, whether he could be trusted with the final piece of what she knew. Then she nodded slowly. Nathaniel Gray, she said. For the second time that night, Dario felt the ground shift beneath a truth he had never questioned. Nathaniel had been with him even longer than Marco, a quiet, steady presence who had protected Dario's life more times than either of them had ever bothered to count. The idea that Nathaniel, of all people, had willingly handed the one secret Dario had never shared with anyone, to a stranger, felt almost impossible to accept. That's not possible, Dario said. Nathaniel installed that lock himself. He's the most loyal man I have. He wouldn't hand my own security to someone he'd never met. He didn't hand it to a stranger, Elena said quietly. He's known who I am for almost 3 years. My father saved Nathaniel's life once, long before any of this happened, long before you and Nathaniel ever crossed paths. A boating accident, out near the eastern docks, the same docks my father's company used to operate on. Nathaniel was 17 years old and drowning, and my father was the only person nearby willing to risk his own safety to pull him out of the water. Nathaniel never forgot that. When he eventually learned what had really happened to my father, and who was responsible, he made a choice. He decided that someday, if the chance ever came, he would help me get the truth in front of you directly, rather than let it stay buried forever under 20 years of loyalty to a lie. Dario sat down slowly on the edge of the bathtub, the fight draining out of his posture as the full weight of everything Elena had told him settled into place. Two of the men he trusted most in the world, men who had stood beside him through every dangerous year of building his empire, had each, in their own way, been keeping a piece of this truth from him for years. Marco, by orchestrating the lie that started it all. Nathaniel, by quietly deciding, on his own, that Dario deserved to eventually learn what that lie had cost. Why now? Dario said quietly. After 3 years of Nathaniel knowing who you are, why choose tonight, of all nights, to finally let you inside? Because tonight was the first night in years that Marco felt completely safe, Elena said. Nathaniel told me that himself. He said Marco would be relaxed, distracted, celebrating a victory he believed was entirely his own doing. He said that was the only kind of night where you might actually be willing to sit still long enough to hear the truth, instead of reacting the way you would have on any ordinary night, when every instinct in you is built around suspicion and control. Dario absorbed that in silence, understanding, even through his anger and confusion, the strange logic behind it. Nathaniel knew him well enough to know exactly when a door like this one might actually open, not just physically, but emotionally, and he had waited patiently for years for that single narrow window to arrive. What do you want from me? Dario said finally, looking up at Elena, with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the late hour. You've told me the truth. You've upended 20 years of trust in a matter of minutes. What happens now as far as you're concerned? Elena was quiet for a long moment before she answered. I don't want anything from you, Dario, not the way you mean it. I'm not here to ask for money or power, or some kind of place inside your world. I came here because I needed you to know the truth, and because some part of me believed that a man capable of building everything you've built was also capable of doing something meaningful with that truth, once he finally had it. What you do next is entirely up to you. I won't pretend I don't have an opinion about it, but the decision was never mine to make. Dario studied her for a long moment, searching for any trace of manipulation in her words and finding none. Whatever Elena Whitfield had come here hoping to accomplish, it did not appear to be anything as simple as revenge or personal gain. She had risked her life to deliver a truth that cost her nothing to keep buried and everything to reveal. and she seemed prepared to walk away from this room with nothing more than the knowledge that she had finally said what she came to say. "If I go out there right now," Dario said slowly, thinking out loud, "and confront Marco in front of everyone, it ends badly. Not just for him, for all of us. 20 years of loyalty built around him doesn't unravel quietly, and the people in that room tonight would have to choose sides in a conflict most of them don't even know exists yet." "I know," Elena said. "That's part of why I didn't come here with a plan to expose him publicly. I came here to give you the truth, not to hand you a script for what to do with it." Dario rose from the edge of the tub, moving to stand near the small window at the far side of the bathroom, staring out at the lights of the city he had spent 2 decades learning to control. Somewhere out there, in one direction or another, was the answer to what came next. Though for the first time in longer than he could remember, Dario Moretti had absolutely no idea which direction that was. "I need time," he said finally, "not to decide whether what you've told me is true. I believe you, more than I want to admit. I need time to decide what kind of man I want to be, now that I know what I know. 20 years of decisions built on top of a lie doesn't get undone in a single night." "That's fair," Elena said, and something in her posture eased slightly, as though she had been half expecting him to demand an immediate answer, a resolution as swift and decisive as the reputation that preceded him. "I'm not asking you to fix 20 years of consequences before the sun comes up. I'm asking you to start somewhere, whenever you're ready." Dario turned back to face her, and for the first time since the door had opened, something like respect crossed his expression, quiet and unspoken but unmistakably present. "You could have destroyed me tonight," he said. "You had the truth, and you had the opportunity, and instead of using either of those things as a weapon, you handed them to me and asked nothing in return. Most people in my world would have made a very different choice." "I'm not most people in your world," Elena said simply. "I never wanted to be." A long silence settled between them, different now from the tense stillness that had defined their conversation from the start. Somewhere down the hallway, the celebration continued without them, unaware that the man being celebrated had just spent the last half hour learning that the foundation of his entire life rested on a lie told to him when he was young enough to believe it without question. "I need you to leave the way you came in," Dario said finally, "before anyone else notices you were ever here. Nathaniel will know how, and I need you to trust me, at least enough to give me the time to figure out what happens next, without turning this into something that gets either of us hurt before I've had the chance to decide anything properly." Elena studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I trusted you enough to walk into a locked room alone tonight," she said. "I can trust you a little longer." Dario reached past her and unlocked the small side panel he had almost forgotten existed, the maintenance access Nathaniel had insisted on installing years ago for emergencies that had never once occurred, until tonight. As Elena moved toward it, she paused, glancing back at him one final time. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I don't think you're the man I spent years imagining you to be. I think you're a man who made a choice a long time ago based on information someone else gave you. And I think tonight is the first real choice you've made for yourself in longer than you probably realize." She disappeared through the narrow passage before Dario could find a response, leaving him alone in the quiet bathroom with nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the distant, oblivious laughter still drifting down the hallway from the celebration he no longer had the heart to return to. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door Nathaniel had unlocked out of loyalty to a debt 20 years old, thinking about Marco laughing 60 feet away, utterly unaware that the ground beneath his own carefully built position had just begun, quietly and irreversibly, to shift. Dario splashed water on his face before he walked back out into the hallway, needing a moment to arrange his expression into something that resembled the man who had left that celebration 20 minutes earlier. By the time he reached the main room, he had mostly succeeded. Marco looked up from across the room and raised his glass in greeting, his face open and easy, utterly untouched by the weight of what Dario now understood about him. "There he is," Marco said warmly, "starting to think you'd fallen asleep in there." "Just needed a minute to breathe," Dario said, and the words felt strange in his mouth, because for once, they were completely true. He took the glass someone handed him and let the conversation move around him, laughter and stories and plans for what came next, now that Callahan's territory was finally settled. He smiled when it was expected. He nodded at the right moments, and the entire time some part of his mind stood apart from the room, watching Marco with new eyes, searching his familiar face for signs of the calculation Elena had described, the ambition that had once been willing to sacrifice a stranger's entire family to protect a secret business Dario had never even known existed. He found himself studying Nathaniel too, standing near the window as he always did, quiet and watchful. Their eyes met once across the room, and something passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Nathaniel gave the smallest nod, barely a movement at all, an acknowledgement that the conversation Dario had just had, and the choice that conversation now placed in front of him, had been years in the making. The celebration wound down slowly over the following hour, guests drifting out in twos and threes, until only Marco and Nathaniel remained, the two men Dario trusted most in the world, standing in the same room together, each carrying a piece of a truth that the other did not yet know he possessed. "Big day tomorrow," Marco said, setting down his empty glass. "Callahan's people will want reassurance that the transition stays smooth. I'll handle the calls first thing." "Good," Dario said, and it came out steadier than he expected. "I want you focused entirely on that tomorrow, nothing else." Marco caught something in his tone, a flicker of unfamiliar formality, and studied Dario for a moment before shrugging it off, attributing it, most likely, to exhaustion after a long and difficult 6 months finally coming to an end. "Get some sleep," Marco said, clapping a hand briefly on Dario's shoulder before heading for the door. "You earned it tonight." Dario watched him leave, feeling the weight of that casual touch differently than he ever had before, and when the door finally closed behind Marco, only Nathaniel remained in the room. "You knew," Dario said quietly, once they were alone. "For 3 years you knew who she was and what she was carrying, and you said nothing." "I wasn't ready to say anything," Nathaniel said, his voice steady but not without weight. "Not until I was certain you'd actually be willing to listen instead of reacting. You've built a life around trusting very few people completely, Dario. I couldn't risk bringing this to you carelessly and losing everything Elena had worked years to piece together, not when there was finally a chance to do it right. You gave a stranger the code to the most secure room in my life," Dario said. "She wasn't a stranger to me," Nathaniel said simply, "and I gave her that code because I decided, a long time ago, that you deserved to know the truth about the man standing closest to you, even if it meant risking my own place at your side to make that happen. I've served you faithfully for 20 years, Dario. I'm not asking you to forget that tonight, but I'm not going to apologize for finally doing something I believed was right, even when it was difficult." Dario studied the man who had protected his life more times than either of them could count, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that his anger toward Nathaniel had already begun settling into something quieter, closer to grim respect. Nathaniel had not betrayed him. He had simply carried a debt of conscience for 3 long years, waiting patiently for the one moment when delivering it might actually do some good, instead of causing needless damage. "I need you to help me with something," Dario said finally. Quietly. "No mistakes, and nothing that puts Elena in danger, now or later." Nathaniel nodded once, already understanding the shape of what was being asked without needing further explanation. "What do you want done about Marco?" Dario was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over carefully, weighing it against everything he had learned that night. 20 years ago, he might have answered that question swiftly and without hesitation, the way he had answered 100 similar questions across his career. But something had changed in him over the course of one impossible half-hour in a locked bathroom, and the man standing in the empty room now was not entirely the same one who had walked into that celebration earlier in the evening. "Nothing sudden," Dario said. "Nothing that draws attention or turns this into a war inside our own house. I want his influence pulled back slowly, piece by piece, until the people who depend on him for their positions no longer depend on him at all. I want every part of his hidden business found and dismantled quietly, without him ever fully understanding how or when it started slipping away from him. And I want it done in a way that leaves absolutely no path back to Elena, now or years from now, no matter what eventually happens to Marco." "That will take time," Nathaniel said. "I have time," Dario said. "What I don't have anymore is the excuse of not knowing." Over the weeks that followed, Dario moved with the same patience and precision that had built his empire in the first place, except now that precision was aimed inward, dismantling something rotten at the very center of his own trusted circle, rather than expanding outward against outside threats. Marco noticed nothing at first, distracted by the ordinary demands of managing new territory, unaware that every quiet transfer of responsibility, every small shift of loyalty among the men beneath him, was part of a deliberate unraveling that Dario had set into motion the very night he learned the truth. Elena, for her part, disappeared from Dario's life as quietly as she had entered it, though not entirely. Once a month, through channels only Nathaniel understood, funds moved from an account with no name attached to a modest new business Elena had quietly begun building for herself, far from the docks where her father's life had once been taken from her. Dario never asked to see her again, and she never asked him to. Some debts, he had come to understand, were better honored through action than through conversation. 6 months after that night, Marco Bellini found himself, almost without understanding exactly how it had happened, standing at the edge of an organization that no longer fully trusted him, his hidden business dismantled piece by people who never once mentioned his name in connection with its collapse. He left the city quietly not long after, choosing, in the end, to disappear from Dario's life the same way Vincent Whitfield had once been forced to disappear from his own family's, except this time, nobody's life had been taken to make it happen. Dario stood on the balcony of his penthouse one evening, months later, looking out over the same city he had looked out over the night. Everything changed, and found that the view looked different to him now, though nothing about the skyline itself had actually shifted. He thought of the young man he had been 20 years earlier, eager to prove himself, willing to trust the people closest to him, without ever questioning the stories he was given. He thought of the man he had slowly grown into instead, powerful and controlled and, for 2 decades, completely unaware of the lie sitting at the very foundation of everything he had built. He thought, too, of Elena, standing so calmly at that sink, delivering a truth that could have destroyed her along with him, and choosing instead to trust that he was capable of doing something meaningful with it. She had been right, in the end, though it had taken him time to prove it, not through grand gestures or dramatic reckonings, but through the slow, careful work of finally becoming a man who chose his own decisions, rather than simply carrying out the ones handed to him by people he trusted too completely. Nathaniel joined him on the balcony as the sun began to set, saying nothing for a long moment, simply standing beside him the way he always had, loyal in a way that had proven itself, in the end, far deeper than Dario had ever fully understood. "Any regrets?" Nathaniel asked finally, about how it all played out. Dario considered the question honestly before answering. "I regret that it took a stranger walking through a locked door to show me something I should have questioned on my own, years ago," he said. "But I don't regret what came after. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I know exactly why I made the decisions I made tonight, and every night since. That's worth more to me now than any territory I've ever fought to control." The city lights began to flicker on below them, one by one, the same view Dario had looked out over 100 times before, except now, for the first time in 20 years, he was looking at it as a man who finally understood the full weight and true cost of everything he had built, and who had finally chosen, deliberately and completely, to build whatever came next on something more solid than a lie he had never thought to question. Behind him, the door to that small, locked bathroom remained exactly where it had always been, though Dario had quietly changed the code the very morning after that night, choosing a new set of numbers known only to himself. Not because he no longer trusted Nathaniel, but because he had finally learned, in the most unexpected way imaginable, that even the most secure life a man could build was only ever as strong as the truth it was built upon, and that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed again in quite the same way.